welcome everybody. I've seen many of you before. My name is Leslie Hubbard. I am the program manager at the Syngenta Institute, and this is part of our Careers in Climate Action series. We have one more event after this, and we'll be bringing this back in the spring semester, so thank you all so much for being here. As you can tell, the event is being recorded, so please be mindful of the recording. And if you have your phone on, please silence it, and then we will also be providing dinner after this, just in the space next door. So I'm really excited to introduce our guest speakers today. So first I'd like to introduce Ben Webster, who is currently the Director of Policy at MIQ Methane Intelligence, which is a not-for-profit climate tech foundation undertaking cutting-edge work to reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas sectors. Ben has an extensive background in the environmental policy and government relations. Most recently, he served in the leadership of the University of Colorado Boulder's graduate programs in sustainability and environmental management. And prior to this, he served as the managing director of the Sustainability Innovation Lab at Colorado, which is an innovative co-working space at the University of Colorado driving sustainability solutions between NGOs, startups, and the university. And before moving to Boulder, he advised senior members of Congress on water resources, infrastructure, sustainability, and public health issues while working as a staffer for the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was involved in legislation and administrative oversight concerning the Clean Water Act, water infrastructure, and other water resource policies. And Ben has also worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the National Resources Defense Council, the National Academy of Public Administration, and the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And Ben has recently worked with the Blue-Green Alliance on the scope of oil and gas operations in Colorado and New Mexico. And he received his PhD in government and his Master of Public Policy degree from Georgetown, and he has a BA in political science from Bates College. And sitting next to Ben, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jason Neff, who is currently the Soil and Climate Innovation Principal Scientist at the Syngenta Group, headquartered in Switzerland. In his role, Dr. Neff leads efforts to identify and deploy new technologies and reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and improve soil health and agricultural productivity. From 2003 to 2023, Dr. Neff was a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder and the founding director of the Sustainability Innovation Lab at Colorado, created to accelerate the development of youth-inspired sustainability science and technology. And in recent years, Dr. Neff led efforts to develop new analytical tools to support smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa and served as the chief scientist for a startup company focused on natural carbon sequestration solutions. Dr. Neff has a PhD from Stanford and a BA in environmental biology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And he's also author of more than 100 academic publications and an introductory environmental science textbook called A Changing Planet, and has raised more than $30 million in funding from government and nonprofits to support research in sustainability science. And last but not least, I would like to introduce this evening's moderator, Esther Tamara, who is currently a first-year Master's in Public Policy student at the Kennedy School, and she is also an intern at the Syngenta Institute. Prior to her time at Harvard, Esther most notably served as an associate at Indonesia's largest foreign policy organization, where she led the organization's climate and environmental advocacy efforts for a net zero Indonesia by 2050. And under her directives, the campaign garnered national attention from policymakers and grassroots organizations. And she's been quoted in local and international media such as CNN Indonesia and Climate Home News in the UK. And Esther additionally holds a BA in International Relations with dual minors in Economic and Political Science from the University of Massachusetts. So thank you all for being here. And we will start.
Thank you, Leslie, for the introduction. So I guess we can just, kick off the conversation. I'll ask a few questions to you, Ben and Jason, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. Feel free to ask any questions, whether that's career related or whether it's topical related. So my first question is, can you please just introduce yourself, what you do in your role at MIQ, and then Jason at Syngenta?
Sure. First, let me thank you, Esther, for facilitating this, and Leslie, to you and the Syngenta Institute for inviting us. As Leslie noted, I used to be at the University of Colorado Boulder and had a variety of positions, but amongst those was working with grad students. And one of my favorite and most satisfying activities is being able to engage with students and individuals who are entering into the environmental and sustainability spaces and talk with them about kind of what's their career trajectory looking like. So I've been looking forward to this evening for quite a while, and this is a great opportunity. So thank you all for being here. So I'm the Director of Policy for MIQ, and MIQ is a not-for-profit organization which originally span out of the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is a fairly large environmental think tank NGO. And MIQ, as I think we'll talk about in a little bit, the organizational mission is to drive down methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. And so my role as Director of Policy is to work with federal, state, and on some occasions, international policymakers to work on creating a policy environment that will facilitate the market-oriented work that we do to engage with oil and gas companies to work on driving down their emissions.
Great. And Dr. Neff?
Yeah, thanks. Echo Ben's thanks for having us out, and thanks to all of you for braving the weather out there and coming tonight. So my position didn't exist before May of this past year. So I've been working with Syngenta for about a year. The position is Soil and Climate Innovation Principal Scientist. And so I'm still figuring out what that job is and trying to figure out how to sort of grow this within the company. But basically, I'll just give you a little background on Syngenta. A lot of people don't know what it is. The ag sector is consolidated in a lot of different ways. So Syngenta has 59,000 employees worldwide. It's one of the largest agricultural input companies in the world, with the two primary businesses being seeds, so production of new crops, new genetic varietals, et cetera, and crop protection. So what you would have known as pesticides and herbicides, now moving in all sorts of really interesting directions with new biological controls, biomolecules, all sorts of new things there. So it's a massive company, $32 billion in revenue last year, operates all over the world. So my job, I think, as I'm sort of constructing it as I go, is to think about how do we bring forward new products and innovations that either serve to improve soils and sort of rebuild the fertility that's been lost in agricultural systems over hundreds of years of agriculture in some cases, or, because sometimes these go together, reduce carbon and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So that means going in from the very beginning with early stage candidates for products before they're to the point where we know that they're going to come out. Syngenta spends about $1.5 billion a year on R&D. So starting there, all the way up through development phases where you've got products, you think you know how they're going to go to market, but you have all these questions of like, maybe there's some things we could do to bring down emissions when this product does come to market. What would that look like? And then actually the last thing I'll mention, my favorite part of the job right now is actually working with commercial teams. In the US, in other parts of the world that are out selling products, trying to figure out when we have the opportunity, how do we make sustainability attributes of those products a component of the sales, right? Something that actually drives those sales into markets and accelerates, the growth of solutions. So I'm kind of spanning that range and trying to figure out how to move things along in that direction.
Yeah, following up on that, when we looked at the Syngenta profile, it kept mentioning, breakthrough technologies that can cut down greenhouse gas emissions. Can you share a little bit about what is the most exciting technology, I guess, in that space that you're leading or under your purview, and how does that tie into, I guess, global climate action and reducing, emissions and then the race to zero and everything else?
Yeah, so I think we'll come back around to it, but so agriculture is a massive emitter of greenhouse gases, I think a quarter of global emissions, and it is like a sticky, hard sector to solve. Like, this is not easy. It makes EVs look easy, and EVs were not an easy solution. I'll just mention one product right now because I think it's an interesting example. So one of the largest sources of greenhouse gases emissions in agriculture is livestock. particularly ruminants like cattle, where there's a lot of methane that's produced. So we have a product that there'll be some announcements out relatively soon that basically makes feeding the feed of those animals much more efficient. So it means that you need less corn coming into the production of either beef or dairy to generate the same amount of product. And that reduces emissions by about 5% relative to what's typical. That doesn't sound like a lot, but in last year's numbers, that was about 1.7 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent saved in the United States, equivalent to taking about 130,000 cars off the road. And there's some big news coming on that pretty soon with some big agreements to really expand that use of that product. So part of my job now is trying to figure out, like, how do we add more? Because 5% is not enough. We actually need to get more toward about 30% by 2030. So what else can we bring into these production systems to bring those emissions down and serve the heavy demand for dairy and for meat production?
Talking about livestock and methane, I'll go back to you, Ben. So most of the climate discourse, especially on the global level, has been primarily focused on carbon emissions, but methane actually has 80 times the warming potential, right?
Absolutely.
So can you talk to us a little bit about what has been the opportunities and challenges, working in the space and reducing methane emissions?
Sure. So as Esther noted, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this, there are a variety of different greenhouse gas constituents, and we often think about CO2, but methane, which comes from a variety of different sources, which I'll touch on in a minute, but methane is amongst the most serious, and over a 20-year time horizon, it is has 80 times the warming potential than the equivalent amount of CO2. Now, the methane sources that are usually looked at are landfills, agriculture, to Jason's point, and oil and gas. For a variety of both political and infrastructure reasons, the oil and gas sector and reducing emissions therein is considered the low-hanging fruit of all the climate actions that can be taken. And the reason for this is, oil and gas have such a, the methane emissions from oil and gas have such a large impact on climate warming, and the steps that can be taken to control methane emissions from oil and gas operations are fairly localized, meaning it is, one doesn't have to go, compared to agriculture, where you've got farms all over the place, and it's a more dealing with methane emissions from oil and gas operations is a more efficient approach to driving down those emissions. So MIQ's approach to dealing with methane emissions from the oil and gas sector is partially a function of there being an absence of a national or international regulatory regime. And just stepping back a little bit, the oil and gas sector, or natural gas, is a commodity. And there's very little difference between natural gas produced off the coast of Africa versus natural gas produced in Appalachia versus natural gas produced in the Permian. Once it gets into the system, all natural gas looks the same. And what MIQ's approach is to change the actual market of natural gas away from being a commodity product to a differentiated product. And we do this by looking at the environmental attributes associated with natural gas. And so MIQ's basic approach is that we will grade the operations of oil and gas companies based on how leaky or not leaky they are. A company that is not leaking much natural gas will get a higher grade, and a company that's leaking a lot of natural gas or methane will get a lower grade. And then buyers who are interested in buying natural gas with a lower upstream emission profile will buy the gas with a higher grade. And so that becomes a differentiated product. And once you differentiate a market, you start getting competition along the lines of what that market is, in this case, the environmental attributes. So our theory of change is that by creating a differentiated market, we will create competition for market share for cleaner gas. And so we certify companies, and right now we're certifying 20% of U.S. onshore natural gas production. And MIQ's goal is to become the international standard in terms of natural gas production, and take advantage of its kind of global market nature.
Yeah. Curious to follow up. I think earlier this year, President Biden mentioned that his administration will stop involvement in the methane gas standards because there might be risk of greenwashing, right? So how do you mitigate potential greenwashing these certifications? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So this is the notion of greenwashing in any area, whether it's carbon offsets, the work that we do in terms of methane performance certification, or a variety of other areas, is something that's very important to take into account, especially in a system like we're working in. All we are doing, or all we have right now, in the absence of a regulatory framework, is a voluntary market approach. If a company is cutting corners or is not actually lowering emissions to the degree that they say they are, or they're greenwashing in some form, that's going to cause a lack of trust, a lack of credibility within the marketplace itself, and the whole market will be undercut. So the efficacy of our program, of everything that I do, everything that my colleagues do, is based upon having a credible and successful market and growing that market. And the only way you can grow a market is if it's trusted by the public, by investors, by all market participants. So what we have put in place a series of principles to ensure that companies can't use our certification approach for greenwashing purposes, and that our certification approach is as credible as it can be. And the basic tenets of that are that our certification standard is public. So any of you can go to the MIQ site right now, download the certification standard, and work out or see how the grades are assigned. We ensure that all wells and equipment within a given basin that are owned by a company that's being certified are included, and not just individual wells that may give a false impression of the methane performance of that site. Most importantly, we use a third-party auditor or verifier to go onto the site and audit the company operations, look at data, look at reporting data, talk to employees, and they provide a grade recommendation to us, and then we provide the grade and the subsequent certificates. So the use of a third-party auditor and putting in steps to avoid conflicts of interest is really central to trying to build a credible system.
Thank you, Ben. I want to go back to Dr. Jason. You mentioned earlier that agricultural products is a huge emitter. And we all know, I think, in most developing countries in Africa and Asia, agricultural emissions is one of the primary emitters in those countries as well. So can you tell us a little bit about how Syngenta is helping these global south countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in that particular industry? I know you also did some work around sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
If you want to talk a little bit about that, please feel free.
Yeah, sure. So, the global south is actually like a really complicated place, and so we tend to say there's kind of developed countries and developed agriculture and less developed economies and less developed agriculture. But I think the reality is if you go to Brazil, there's a lot of farms that look just like a massive farming operation in the US, or parts of Argentina, for example. So there's many parts of Latin America that have massive operations. So in those kinds of settings, any kind of intervention from a large company like Syngenta would look just like it might in Europe or the US. Use of biologicals, biostimulants to reduce fertilizer application. We have a big, so for Brazil, just to stay on that for a moment, there's kind of one core overarching thing with agriculture, which is basically stop converting forest to ag land, period, right? Like that's about a quarter of the emissions right there. So how do you do that? Well, you can get in a lot of different circles around this, but part of it is just by trying to figure out how to take the pressure off those forests in principle, right? If you had strong protection of forests and you were able to ensure production or increase production on existing lands, That's probably better, certainly a better solution than cutting the forest. Having increased production doesn't necessarily decrease pressure on the forest, but in the right combination with policy, it might. So that's one piece, right? So it's trying to figure out how to reduce that pressure. There's another piece that doesn't get talked about a lot in terms of innovation, and that's we have a lot of degraded lands around the world. A lot of places where production is pretty low. I worked a lot in sub-Saharan Africa as a faculty, as a researcher, as a professor. Production, say in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, you might get 1 ton of maize yield per hectare. In the US or in Europe, you're gonna get maybe 12, might be even more. So a tenth, say, of the production somewhere else, that's not enough. And there's a bunch of social stuff that sits on the side of this as well. But in these degraded systems, the question is, like, if you want to take pressure off of natural systems and you want to increase production for other reasons, like food security, how do you do that? One is to try to rebuild the fertility of those systems. So that's a long game. We're not there yet, but we have a big partnership with the Nature Conservancy in Brazil called Reverte, which is restoring degraded pasture land back into production. And that's been a very successful project. What I'm kind of excited about sort of the longer term are a bunch of products that we're trying to bring out in soil health, which would really facilitate the restoration of fertility in soils, bring back the capacity of those systems to support plant growth naturally, or at least with reduced inputs. You can't get away from inputs altogether in agriculture, but you can reduce the demand. So that's kind of the big picture. The smallholder side, it's actually, Syngenta has a foundation, and that's mostly where the smallholder innovation sits in sub-Saharan Africa. And these smallholders, if you're not familiar with that term, are people who farm on a hectare or two. So think of 2 football fields or so, something like that. And on that field with low productivity, you need to make, it's usually primary mode of primary economic activity in the rural parts of sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of South Asia. About 800 million people in those enterprises are below the World Bank poverty line, about $2 a day or so. It's touch and go, especially with climate change. Maybe you get caloric sufficiency for a family. Maybe in a good year, you make a little bit of money off the top of that. You've failed supply chains on the way in. You have virtually no value chain on the way out. It's a very, very challenging system right now. Syngenta has almost nothing to do with that in sub-Saharan Africa, although there's some entry points now and there's a foundation engagement. Part of the reason I switched from academics to a big company is because after working in those systems for a decade, I just feel like we've got to find a way to scale solutions, not bring solutions into sub-Saharan Africa and say this is the way to do it, but figure out whatever the mechanisms are going to be that really accelerate change for the better in those systems. It may not be the company I work with now, but it's got to be something. I guess the last thing I would say about it is there are some really interesting models in the company. So for example, in China, and in contrast to a lot of the rest of the world, Syngenta operates, if you know the China story, basically China was a country made up of smallholder farms, not that long ago, 20 years ago or so. Massive consolidation, huge increase in the use of fertilizers and other inputs. If you've seen environmental news out of China, there's been a lot of the sort of associated environmental impacts with that. So one of the things that is happening in China is sort of trying to bring agriculture forward, with reduced environmental impacts. And so there's a series of what are called modern agricultural practice, basically stores. Think of like an Apple store for agricultural products, and advising with something called fertigation, combined fertilization, irrigation that can reduce fertilizer use, improve varietals, better crop protection to ensure that the crops come off after you put in all these inputs. So those sorts of direct connection with farmers actually do reach into the smallholder setting in South Asia a little bit. And probably has more potential.
Yeah. I think in the past year or so we've been experiencing fertilizer volatility. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that triggered a food crisis. So that just got me thinking, in the next 10, 20 years, we're gonna have more and more billions of people to feed. So how do we feed this 10 billion people sustainably, making sure that, we keep climate in mind when we do that?
Yeah, well, this is the $1 trillion question.
Exactly.
This is the question that gets me out of bed on Monday mornings,
okay,
and makes me pull the covers over my head on Wednesday.
And also join us here.
You know, like it. So like the ag, it's just a crazy story. So like we could meet, like every other sector could meet all of their Paris challenges, and if ag doesn't, like the 1.5 degree, forget that one. Like we're not going to hit that. And in fact, at the current trajectory, ag will be the biggest emitter. Some estimates are up like 80% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 without change. So the question is, what does change look like? Because we can't reduce yields. And in fact, there's a really nice report out that says that if you think we've been really good at increasing yields in agriculture every year, we have to 4x that increase in agricultural yield gain between now and 2050 to meet the food security challenge and also to increase the efficiency of the system. And that's also to reduce the pressure on natural systems. So that's a whole story on innovation, right? New technologies around breeding, new ability to try to figure out how we're going to make crops that work in the new climate future that we're living in. So there's all those questions. I think I hope, fingers are crossed, I'm not going to like mortgage my house on it right now, but like there's a whole suite of biological products coming, biostimulants and biofertilizers. A while ago, these seemed a little like sketchy, you know, maybe not like, maybe it wasn't clear these were going to work, but what can happen with a biofertilizer? So for example, a lot of Brazilian soy goes in with a biostimulant that stimulates the natural nitrogen fixation in soy to the point where Brazilian soy now has very little nitrogen fertilization. That's an enormous impact. And in the US, we don't use any of that, and we fertilize our soy. Why? That's cultural practice. So I have some hope that these sorts of biological interventions, these biostimulants, biofertilizers, combined with the sort of doors are opening up with the kind of CRISPR-based genetic modification of plants, are going to be part of our technology package. And then I'll just finish one more thought here, is that like these solutions don't get to market unless somebody is willing to pay for them. I mean, this is the reality of a market-based agricultural system. And so I think like one of our incumbent challenges, certainly one thing that I worry a lot about right now, is like, what is the market for this innovation? And it cannot just be a carbon offset, and it cannot just be like a label on a food package that says this is you know, a climate-friendly bowl of granola. Like there has to be a reason that the grower does better, the return on investment, so I'm reducing fertilizer, the stability in yield, the increase in yield, the reduction in yield vulnerability to climate. These are all attributes that can be part of a go-to-market strategy for climate-leaning technologies. But they're not there yet. So I think that's where a big part of the innovation has to sit.
Thank you, Jason. And we'll open up the floor for questions right after this. So please feel free to start prepping your questions after this. Ben, so you work in as director of policy. So obviously you monitor a lot of policies regarding methane. There's the Methane Summit, that was hosted by the White House for 2 years in a row, and then there's the Global Methane Pledge. Can you tell us whether these initiatives or this momentum will eventually, get us to where we want in terms of methane reductions, and what are the challenges now?
Yeah, so great question. And I think that as is the case with many of these environmental and climate problems, it's bring to bear a whole bunch of tools. And so I think that federal funding, federal statutory and regulatory efforts are necessary, but they're not sufficient. And so we need to be able to bring market measures, like the work that MIQ is leading, to help address these really tricky climate problems. Now, you mentioned the Methane Summit that was held at the White House. Very important. Anytime the White House holds an event that is raising that particular issue onto the agenda at nearly the highest level. There was one major issue with that Methane Summit, which was held in August, is that there were no oil and gas companies invited. And so I think that one of the interesting thing about this discussion tonight is I work for a nonprofit, but our primary stakeholder group, right, are oil and gas companies. Jason here is working for big ag, right? And so the question is, what role should these kind of in some ways these pariah sectors be what role should they play in solutions? And my response is, having worked on the Hill and in policy for my entire career, is that you can't push aside or neglect particular sectors just because of the work that they're doing, and because there may be actual actions that those entities can take where incentives are aligned and solutions can be realized. And by not inviting them to the table, as the White House just did or didn't do, that is missing a real opportunity to create solutions. And so I think the one of the key things for all of us in the environmental and sustainability space is to think about, how do we align incentives, right? How do you bring together a coalition? How do you engage with stakeholders which don't necessarily have the same views or motivations as you? And then how do you bring those different groups together or organizations together in order to realize some type of collective goal? That's the challenge. But if you can create that coalition and everyone's pointed in the same direction, you can get some real gains can be made. And so I think that certainly, to Jason's point about where's the market, thinking about how do you create markets in terms of alignment of incentives is really key.
Thank you. And do we have any questions from the students? Yeah. Please introduce yourself, your name, which college you are associated with.
Sure. Sorry, I was just putting the question down because it's slightly long. Hi, everybody. I'm Komal Parak, and I'm associated with the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences, but I'm also pursuing research with the Growth Lab at the Kennedy School. My research focus is in the business economics area, but I'm also associated with the Manhattan 2 project, which is climate tech research nonprofit, and the director of which, Glenn Van Reb, you might know him. He just recently published a book on how to save a planet, where he talks about resolving climate change at the lowest possible cost. And his whole goal, like the main agenda of his book, is it proposes a law and legislation for decarbonization across the US and the globe. And he also suggests that such a law would require like a strong political coalition. But I mean, he suggests a lot of points like importing carbon fuels for states, and which would like have potential benefits, for the states. And he also suggests a lot of like low-cost strategies for electric companies to massively scale solutions for decarbonization. But what are your thoughts on something like this, like a legislation for decarbonization?
So one of the big takeaways that I developed when I worked in the Hill is that it is possible for any of us in this room, okay, pick your policy area, dig into that policy area. It is possible for all of us to come up with the solution to a problem. Okay, health policy, education policy, climate issues. You can come up with the solution, right? And at the end of the day, it doesn't mean a thing if it's not realistic, if you can't actually move that forward. So the art of policymaking is being able to identify the frame in which policy currently exists and be able to work out which parts of that frame are actually feasible to push out. And it may be that policy objective, that grand policy objective that we have, may be feasible by pushing out the part of the frame, or it may sit on the other side. And if it sits on the other side, you've got to come up with a different policy objective. So part of the issue that we're in right now is you look at the major environmental statutes, right? When was the last time the Clean Air Act had substantive amendments? Right, 1990. Right, the major environmental statutes were passed in the early 70s. We haven't been able to do a thing, right, at the federal level for the most part, in any of the areas, in any environmental areas. Stuff's happening at the state level, but then that's patchwork, it becomes inefficient, some states are doing things, some states aren't. So there's opportunity on the margins right now to engage with federal legislation, but I don't think that's the answer or the approach to address the problems that we need to address tomorrow, if not yesterday, right? And so that's where we've got to think about what are other levers we can pull to engage systemic change. And so in my case, with methane being such a important greenhouse gas, utilizing, as much as I would love there to be tight federal regulations, they're emulated across every country in the world, right? The tool that we have right now that has great potential to see major results that are with utilizing efficient means is through market mechanisms.
I think the one thing that I would add, I mean, if I could wave my magic wand, I'd love to have like a global carbon policy, carbon tax, like it would make life easier. Thing is that, I mean, no mechanism's perfect. Markets fail all the time, policy fails all the time. Europe has been incredibly, let's just say, strong about new policies. Certainly in the ag sector, Europe has moved so fast that they move beyond the capacity of the technology to support the solution space. So Europe is going to have a very interesting challenge. That's why you see farmers protesting on the streets in Europe, of trying to figure out like how to sustain what can be very contradictory goals in a very, very complicated system. So, that's just a cautionary tale about policy. But I guess the flip side, which maybe I'll just twist it a little bit more to say kind of like what's the academic kind of industry role here, is that there are some of these spaces we don't know how to solve the problems. I spent 20 years in academics, and now I'm sitting in a company. They both have their ups and their downsides, but we don't have solutions to a lot of these problems. So if we had a policy across the U.S. today said decarbonize agriculture by 25%, good luck. Who's responsible for that? I mean, that's a collective failing of the research, of the application, of the deployment, of the market scaling mechanisms, of the policy levers. Like, we don't even know how to do it right now. And so there's some of these areas are just really, really challenging, and we need to figure out how to make this collective system work more effectively.
Do you have any more questions?
I'm Abby. I'm a senior at the college studying history of science and molecular biology. And I'm wondering, what is something you know now in your career that you wish you had known at the beginning of your career in environment and sustainability?
I don't know, I started a long time ago. I'm getting old. So I think what really strikes me right now is the whole thing has changed. Like when I was doing a PhD coming out, like there are a few people who will go off and work for McKinsey or something, but like this whole notion of there being sustainability focused engines within large companies or opportunity to engage in those spaces, that was like brand new. And then when you saw like chief sustainability officers and offices of sustainability, those are usually people who'd switched over because of passion or whatever from, it's not their area of training, right? They came over. And now this is becoming this incredibly technical, challenging area where companies are facing massive challenges, and like the training to enter into a conversation about carbon markets right now is like you almost need a PhD to have the conversation. So like the whole ground has shifted. So I guess what I would have done, I would have like gone to sleep for 30 years and then like come back at this point, because I would make really different decisions now than I was able to make back then. I'd be well rested too.
Right.
So yeah, it helps.
Mine's probably more mechanical, which is I think the key thing, especially early in one's career or when one is still undergrad or in grad school, is engaging with as many people as you can and being curious about the work that they're doing and the problems that they're working on. And I think just trying to build that base of knowledge across a variety of different areas within kind of a certain sector. And you do that through just curiosity and networking. And I think that provides the context, connections, but also makes you smarter, right? And allows you to start connecting dots. And I think that that is something that I would have benefited from earlier in my career. Just that really conscientious, intentional engaging with different folks.
Thank you.
And you had a question earlier?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions. I guess I'll start with maybe a question or two for Jason. First, I'm curious how you view opportunities for partnering specifically with startups in your role. I know that I think Syngenta has like an internal VC arm, but I'm curious if beyond that what some like projects might look like. And then I guess if there's time, a second question is, I think Syngenta is owned by like a ChemChina.
ChemChina, yeah.
So I'm curious how that influences your role, the sustainability priorities, the funding and resources that you get to do what you do.
Sure. I'll start with that one and then come back around on the ventures. So Syngenta used to be public up till 2017, was purchased and taken private with majority ownership by ChemChina. It's still a Basel-based Swiss company. It's honestly, to me, that's what it feels like. There's not, I've never felt like, it just feels like a corporation as far as I can tell. It's going to come back public at some point in the next year or so. But to be honest, like I don't think I would discern a difference. Now there may be, but I wouldn't feel it. In sustainability in general, I think, all these big companies are trying to figure out how to invest and where to invest and what that looks like. So, that's, I think, a common issue. In terms of the venture side, I do advising for the venture arm with Syngenta. So I sit on a lot of calls for startups. So two things. So the first one is that I have to say, like, the vast majority of the startups that I've listened to pitches from in the last 6 months have all been about measuring carbon and MRV for carbon offsets. And I swear, like, all of us on the calls are just like, really? Like, this is not, like, I understand that this is like a market opportunity that people have targeted, but the pricing isn't there, the scaling isn't there, the delivery of value to the growers, like farmers who are actually doing implementation, it doesn't align with the economics. As far as these are my opinions. And so the plea there on the venture side is, or on the startup side is like, stop bringing forward carbon offset MRV plays, please. Come forward with something that actually solves real problems of sustainable food production, and brings forward high yields, more sustainable yields, lower inputs, and figure out how that works economically. So that's kind of that side. I think the place where startups are really interesting in a company like Syngenta is that, it's a big company, and just like a big university, things move slow and it becomes sort of ossified and you get silos and all that sort of stuff. So a lot of times the innovations come in from the outside. So it's not a startup, but Syngenta bought a biologicals company called Villagra for $500 million a few years ago, and that's the entire biologicals operation now. But there's plenty of products coming out of startups that are licensed in because they're frankly ahead of the curve. And that's something that startups can do really, really well, is get ahead of the curve because you're not constrained by all these sort of big funding mechanisms.
Are there any more questions? We have time for questions, yes.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for listening. So I'm Ya from School of Design, and I have a background in industrial design. So I guess my interest is in how manufacturing can work with sustainability. So I remember Jason, you mentioned something about the agricultural, the fertilizer product that you were making. You mentioned something like how to make sustainability part of, contribution to market sales, and also you have mentioned about from a market perspective, we need to find the customers to we need to create a new market in order to introducing new products or changes in the company. So I kind of want to hear more about this project.
I can start with, so I think a lot of in every corporation that's dealing with scope 1, 2, 3 stuff, that scope 1, 2, especially the scope 2 space, there's an enormous sort of opportunity there for improving industrial production practices. So if you're making a fertilizer, you're making an input, or you're making a table, it doesn't matter. All those things can be done more efficiently, and that's a huge opportunity space. There's some interesting things that sit just outside of that. So for example, just with, say fertilizers, if you look at the emission profile from fertilizers, both from the production phase and then from the use phase where N2O is generated, the form of fertilizer and where it's produced because that goes into the energy that went into it and all that, is enormously, it's kind of, actually it's analogous to the methane a little bit. Like the ammonium nitrate that's made in Europe looks different than the ammonium nitrate made in the US. And different forms of these things have really different environmental profiles in different parts of the world. So if you think of it from that kind of industrial design perspective, I think like, if you think end to end about those types of products, there's an opportunity to really sort of target the production through the deployment phase so as to minimize carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. But the challenge is getting a company to recognize, and everybody else, not just the company, everybody else to recognize the benefit that happens downstream. Sometimes it's called avoided emissions, sometimes it's called scope 4. It's how do you drive that innovation out toward all the way through the entire life cycle and even potentially beyond in a product like that. That's really a sort of an emerging challenge, I think.
Hi, I'm Theo. I'm a sophomore at the college. So you both talk about the importance of market-based climate solutions, but you also raise skepticism about a lot of the ways that those markets can solidify into something that creates a lot of fundraising. So you say federal solutions are going to be difficult, or global solutions because carbon taxes aren't really implementable. You say that the carbon credit market is itself something we should be skeptical of, which is fair, right? Should be. And then, given that that is true, and that you also seem to say that companies are going to not necessarily, with greenwashing existing, going to create the most beneficial voluntary solutions. Like, what are the changes you want to see in the market and in the financial sector to make the market structure work for promoting innovations and promoting climate spending?
Yeah, so I think the work that we are doing, so it's a great question, and the work that we are doing really hones in on the question, in that we are trying to create a new market from what currently exists as effectively a commodity space. And so if you can create that new market, then profit incentives, etc., are going to profit incentives, pursuit of market share, are going to drive better behavior, right? And so the challenge there is, I think to your question, is how do you create that market in and of itself? And doing that, one has to create a new type of product which is different than that commodity space. And in creating that new differentiated product, it has to be credible. There has to be credibility within the product itself, as well as in the transactional framework. Okay? So there are a lot of steps, but I think that if those steps are built correctly, then you can leverage that market, those markets, to actually drive down whatever environmental problem, in this case greenhouse gas emissions, that you want to. So I think the key here is that there are areas where it's difficult. There are areas where one should be suspect about certain products, but that is not to say that this is a problem that can't be tackled.
Maybe I'll just add 2 examples onto that, coming from really different places. So in Europe, as I mentioned before, you sound pretty skeptical, but you look for the spaces where you can work, right? So Europe has been very aggressive about regulation. One of those regulations says that you cannot, like a European farmer cannot plant a crop and send it into a biofuel, like biomethane production, if it displaces a food crop. So we've seen this through the whole biofuel development phase. What that is actually doing is generating some really interesting conversations about just how short you can make the growing seasons, which is a technical possibility, right? You can bring down the growing season crops, how you can stack the rotations, and how you can take one of those rotations and send it off to biomethane production without actually having a net impact on the food production. And in doing so, you can actually be more efficient with the use of fertilizers and other things. So there's a top-down space that might actually stimulate really interesting innovation in Europe. So that's what happens when the government gets very strong with regulation. US, we don't tend to do that as much, but the Inflation Reduction Act, we're watching that really closely right now, because Treasury is looking at a provision of that basically looks at the biofuel production market and puts a carbon intensity scoring mechanism into that triggers tax rebates. So again, what's the opportunity? How do you get to scale? Well, if you can actually bring feedstocks into the biofuel space that have extremely low carbon intensity, so meaning that few emissions per ton of product produced and then ultimately like methane or something else produced, then we're actually doing something pretty productive with that. And so it's how then would you leverage those tax credits to really drive a new market out of that? And that's up in the air, but we're watching it because if it happens, there's some kind of cool, there's a number of different, everything from cover crops to even like improved efficiency corn production that might actually do some good in that space.
And just to piggyback on that, I think one of the interesting things, an opportunity space is in these global commodity markets, right? So you look at different regions and how these different regions interact with each other. So looking to piggyback on Jason's comments about Europe and the US. So the Europeans are very likely to put in place regulations in the next few years which would put a methane emission, upstream methane leakage emission limit on natural gas being imported into Europe, right? Now those regulations have got no force of law in the US, but it's also a huge market, right? So those regulations are going to put pressure on on US oil and gas producers to clean up their operations. And the trick is, how can the Europeans actually trust the numbers, the methane reporting numbers that are coming out of the US? And that's where a certification organization or an organization which has a credible verification scheme comes in. And so I think these international markets can provide real opportunities for change that transcend regional or transcend traditional state and national boundaries.
I'm going to add one more positive thing because I feel like maybe I was too negative. I mean, so just it builds off of this point about commodity trading. So just a week or so ago, I was in a call with one of the very large global food commodity trading companies. And that whole call was about how do we get more sustainable products into the food system. And that's between a $32 billion input company that can drive some of the innovation in that space and a $50 billion, $60, $70 billion commodity trading organization that's trying to figure out how to get food into, processed goods down their stream. Right? And like the whole conversation was like, what's on the table? Like, how do we do this? So that's kind of cool.
Great. Do we have any more questions? We still have time for questions. If not, I'll ask a question. So in a couple of weeks, we'll have COP28, as we all know, and I'm pretty sure everyone in the room is monitoring, the developments regarding to that. If there's one thing that you want to see coming out of COP, what would it be, realistically? That's a tough question, I know. I'm sorry.
I got a quick answer.
Sure.
Yeah.
I would love to see more focus on agriculture. Mm-hmm. I feel like it's the missing sector. I don't really understand why. It's just left out of these conversations too much, and we got to drive more solutions into that space.
Yeah, I think the various COP meetings are huge affairs, right? And they have a mixed record in terms of producing gains. One of the things I think that that I would look for to come out of COP28 is the elevation of some of these important issues onto the radars of the public and governmental entities. So you look at Paris, where there was the identification of the 1.5C goal. In Glasgow, that was one of the first COPs where methane was really highlighted. I think the agenda setting role of COP and being able to identify a major area that needs to be looked at, whether it's agriculture or funding for the global south to engage in mitigation actions or what have you. There is, I think it's that agenda setting role that I hope is fulfilled.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me in giving an applause for Jason and Ben. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for sharing your insights. We'll have dinner served just outside, and Jason and Ben will stay for dinner, so feel free to chat with them, ask them questions about career or any other thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.